We've talked this morning a lot about a lot of operational issues, and now we're going to talk about that which brings us to the very core of why we're in business, making money. And here to talk to us about making money with data is my esteemed colleague and friend, Justin van der Lande from Analysys Mason. Justin?
Well, good morning. So yeah, just a few things about Analysys Mason in case you're not aware of who we are and what we do. So similar to Susan's company, we do research within the OSS BSS space, and specifically actually Analysys Mason only covers telecoms sector. And I work within the research side of the software bit, and that's really my area which I cover off. So just get used to the buttons. I'm just going to cover off these sort of areas here. So just look at some of the business challenges. And to a certain extent, this is a bit of a refresh. There was a presentation given, I think, in the last year, or certainly the previous year, which I seem to have sat through, which looks at certainly some of the policy or smart charging tactics we've taken on. I suppose if you listen to the vendors over the last year or so, or 2 years, you'd have thought that this is widely adopted everywhere, and we'd all be... every single charging system is going to be sort of smartened up, but we're going to be a bit of a refresh in terms of what's going on, a little bit about some of the technology behind it, and some examples, and finally some conclusions. So this is fairly common stuff. Effectively, here's the problem. We've got data growth, which is on the right-hand side of the charts, broken into a number of different areas, just out of one of our reports that we produce. That's offset by two factors, one of which is obviously the falling costs of data, which is on the left-hand side, which can be quite extreme in some of the markets. And of course, the other bit, which isn't shown on here, is really the cost factors in terms of rolling out new networks. And quite often you'll find, this is particularly for data, and these two examples here are for mobile, similar sorts of graphs, but not identical, are similar for the fixed line business as well. Clearly there's growth going on, but I suppose the conclusion, and this is the hub of it, effectively, is that are those falling costs going to be outweighed by the growth which goes on within the data market sets, or vice versa? So you're going to end up with a deficit. And at the moment, we'll come on to this later on with some of the examples, we're seeing effectively that telecoms companies are doing pretty well. There's some short-term gains which have been come out of this, and we'll come off to some of those conclusions, but it's not a given. You have to do something a little bit differently to the way it is at the moment, and we'll come on to some of those. So let's just look at the next slide set. So one of the ways of making sure that you're, you move away from the old flat rate billing or all-you-can-eat kind of plans are the things which certainly, if you talked about a year or two ago, certainly been obvious that you have to move away from them. We're seeing a gradual move away. I'd say that certain markets like North America, for example, that move's almost complete. You're seeing similar sort of moves that's taken place within more matured markets. As bandwidth comes up, it seems to be that if you've got a glut of bandwidth, generally to encourage people onto those mobile networks, into the broadband mobile networks, prices get slashed. It's sort of a natural reaction from the market guys and all the rest of it. But clearly it's not sustainable as time goes on. That's really something you've got to address. And this is the hub of smart billing or policy-based billing, which we're going to talk through. Policy management is the critical bit here. It's trying to take out some factors, and we'll touch on some of these in a second, as to ways to bill smarter, effectively, and move away from that. So fair usage was the sort of starting point from this. So you'll find that even quite a few years ago, that fair usage, legal things were put into as you signed up on your agreement. The reality is, initially, those weren't really monitored particularly effectively, and as time has gradually come on, they have been, and of course, that was the precursor to essentially putting in tiered pricing. I will say that things like fair usage and caps have got to be a little bit aware of the markets in which you're operating. And I only say it's out of interest in the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see the graph down there, which sort of puts the Nordics right out on the right-hand side in terms of their average usage in terms of data. So if you are hoping to have a uniform policy in terms of fair usage or caps. You've got to be a little bit wary of which markets you're operating, which is, I know, an obvious statement, but there we go. So key thing, starting point, is make sure you move away from an all-you-can-eat flat rate policy, which I think is fairly obvious. And we're seeing. I will say one other thing on this, though. Clearly, even in some mature markets, and I put North America in this, we have seen some oscillation. I think it was T-Mobile who went back in and actually, having removed a flat rate bill in terms of mobile, actually went back and reintroduced it last month. So it depends where they are in the market, how aggressive you want to be, and clearly what bandwidth you've got available to you. But clearly, long-term, moving away from it. So this is that classic graph on the right-hand side. But essentially, the volumes are going up as the previous and the first slide sort of dictated. You've got the revenues going up as well, but maybe not so quick. But you have got another sort of catalyst which comes into play. And that's why North America really has probably been somewhat more advanced than some, let's say, the European market spaces, where costs of new network technology coming out really is putting a real hiccup in terms of the rollout and the profitability of services. So the first obvious thing to happen, clearly, is tiered pricing, and we'll come on to examples later on, but the ability to break that down, put limits on, and charge for those. And tiered pricing initially really has just been around putting data limits, normally on a monthly basis, but we're seeing different ways of bringing that down. So if you do it on a monthly basis, if you do it on a daily basis, you start removing the time scales and the duration of that availability of the bandwidth, megabytes, etc. Makes some sense. If you're an operator, probably less so if you're a user. And there are other restrictions associated with that as well. So we'll come on to some of those examples. So it's been around for some time. Tier pricing plans, they really are probably the most effective method. And it's probably the first step, I guess, in terms of policy-based charging, which a lot of operators do. And you'll see later on that most people who've done policy-based charging have done this initially. Even though there are different increments you can do within that. And also in passing, and one shouldn't forget, one of the main reasons for policy management going into operators in the first place really wasn't for charging. It was for network issues and trying to lower and reduce the overhead required for networks is one of the capacity management effectively is one of the reasons why policy management goes in, and quite often you'll find that that was the original catalyst for the systems going in, and then a subsequent use case has been with the charging side of the business. So these are the sorts of things, and I'm going to run through a few of these, examples of these will be later on in the presentation. So tiered pricing, clearly based on megabits per second. I think the differences and change that's taken place, that used to be really aligned with the sort of post-paid billing mechanism, so it's on a monthly basis. But you're seeing these tariffs come down to a daily approach, or in some cases, for some of the roaming examples, come down to an hourly basis. So you can use all you want for an hour, or you can use a certain number of megabits per hour. It makes some sense as well. That can get broken down, obviously, into types of traffic as well. It could be pure internet, it could be voice over IP, it could be zero rated, for example, or video, or whatever you want to do. So there's policy allows you to be quite segmented in terms of these approaches and break that one, sort of just being a very sort of raw, if you like, megabit per second. It allows you to break all this down. Clearly, clearly we're in here to make money. So the finer grain you can get on these buckets that you can get away with gives you two options, and basically allows you to segment the market in that particular way, which is great. But it also means that if there's more likelihood of exceeding those as well. So if you've got a daily rate opposed to a monthly rate, the chances are that there's a far higher chance of exceeding that. So from an operator's perspective, it's a desirable thing, even though there is an overhead in terms of managing it. There's quality-based pricing, and this sort of drops into two camps. There's one which is sort of boosting. So if you've got a particular bit of video, high-def video, for example, which requires high bandwidth for a temporary period associated with a particular piece of content, you can pay for that specifically. There's very few of those in the market at the moment. I think I've done a bit of a look around the various operators, about 3 services like that operating at the minute. And then there's other ones which have come and gone, to be honest, in terms of quality, which you sign up to a premium rate service. There are clearly issues with things like net neutrality and stuff which come into play here, and that may be one of the reasons why some have disappeared. But effectively, you sign up to a higher premium service. If there's congestion on your local area networks or on your RAN network, you'll get priority over those who haven't done so. I think there may be a play with M2M as well in this area, because certain M2M applications will require, a far higher degree of certainty in terms of data getting through, and there may be some play there. I haven't seen any specifically in that space, but I believe that certain applications will drop into that. Loyalty and promotions, we've got several bits in this, but we've got zero-rated stuff, and particularly for partnerships. So if you're looking at ways of encouraging usage, either at a certain time of day when you find your cell sites not particularly busy, or you're associating it with a third-party offering who want to pay for that. So the ability to actually rate those as a zero rate on your network is quite a useful tactic. We're seeing some of these, particularly some of the emerging markets on the first of those two things, whereby you've got cell sites you've got which are not busy. The ability to dynamically let your users know on those cell sites that they can utilize a discounted rate in terms of their utilization is kind of a cool thing. It burns up those megabytes, which they have in their prepaid particularly, and use them when it's not busy. It helps push and reduce the peaks in terms of usage and liabilities associated with any outstanding balances. So some of the more clever stuff, and again, we're now getting further down certainly for the segmentation URLs or types. These were probably talked about a couple of years ago. We've seen a couple of these come into the market space. It's still fairly early days in terms of doing special packages associated with particular use cases. So we look at things like social media as the classic one, whereby you get a package which you get at either a fixed price or a discounted price associated with access to your Facebook and all the rest of it, or indeed for gaming for that matter. There are certain packages associated with dealing with that. Just two things, one of which is it gives some certainty for usage for using those areas. That's the positive aspect. The secondary bit is obviously you're going to be segmenting up the market in a finer way, which is good news from an operator's perspective, but it's limiting their use case. More successfully, family plans, and certainly in the US, this has been extremely active, and I think that operators out there have been somewhat more ahead of the market than maybe elsewhere. The ability to pull together a number of different family members, and that could even be a business, or indeed it could be an individual with multiple devices, and actually pool your data in one place makes a lot of sense. And certainly I think probably most of us around this room with an iPad, a phone, or maybe two phones and some kind of a laptop, it makes perfect sense to do that and be able to share that among them. The key thing, I think, from an operator's perspective, even though it's sort of counterintuitive in many ways, is that if you're dealing with multiple different individuals, it's a far more stable collection in terms of churn rates, and the ability to retain those guys is going to be far higher than swapping out individuals. So there are good motivations. I haven't got any figures in terms of what those churn rates are. It's still relatively early days, but that would make perfect sense in order to do that. Furthermore, in terms of Wi-Fi, policy can drive this sort of activity as well. So it's Wi-Fi offload, but also you've got policies associated with charging associated with that as well. So there's some simple authentication which you can do between the two different systems, particularly if you're sharing those. Again, there's a massive advantage in terms of offloading that in certain situations, taking it off the RAN, putting it onto Wi-Fi. It's a very much cheaper technology. And indeed, there's a growing usage. I think we probably all do the same thing, particularly when you're roaming, but also when you know that the data rate's going to be costing you real money, you do offload stuff. And the ability to link those two things together is quite key. So finally, just looking at the sort of back end of it. So we looked at sort of trying to trying to remove the sort of flat rate stuff. We're looking at sort of maybe some more innovation in terms of the service types, and there's a whole heap of these. But also there's just keeping who you've got. And I think that bill shock is obviously legislated for in some territories in the world, certainly in the EU. You've got to let people know that you're going to go over budget. but also it's an opportunity as well. And I think this is where the smart guys are getting involved. It's an upsell opportunity. If you're getting close to your bill limit, there are other options you can deploy instead of that. So there's an upsell opportunity which comes in there. And I think that's sort of a realization which has taken place. A lot of bill shock systems, certainly policy-based ones, were put in really on the cheap. It was a regulatory requirement, so the minimum functionality was put in because it was seen as a cost. And now, well, I think maybe sort of second-generation policy's gone in, it's okay, well, maybe we should use this as an opportunity to upsell. If people are running out of capacity on their tariffs, it makes a good sense to do that. Parental control, I think it's fairly self-explanatory. And free overage is a way of dealing with what's the policy in terms of if you're going over your limits, how do you deal with that? Do you actually allow some flexibility for key customers? Do you apply some analytics associated with this? You let them know they've gone over, you mark them as going over, you let them know they're going to have a free sort of element which is going to not be put on their bill, but next month they have been warned. And again, it's an upsell opportunity. So there's quite a lot of smart thinking going on in terms of policy, and I think really it's been over the last 2 years a sort of a change which has taken place from a sort of a network-orientated thing to a regulatory thing to a somewhat more smart thinking in terms of how we're going to get money out of dealing with this. So at the heart of all this is policy management, and you'll see the chart on the right-hand side essentially is the whole of the policy market. It's not just for charging element of it. Policy management systems sort of sit and straddle between the two things. You'll see there's a bit of an inflection going on. So if you're looking at policy management systems over the last few years, you'll see it's been busy. There's been plenty of stuff going into the market space, but there is an inflection point. And we believe that inflection point has been driven really by the association with real-time charging and charging systems, or online charging systems. And you're looking at a distinct change which has gone on within the market space, that policy management systems are now being driven by real-time charging. And we'll come to an output from a bit of a survey in a second. So what do they do? Well, I think we probably covered why they're important to CSPs. I think it's one of the critical bits in being able to charge in a smart way for data and CSPs. I suppose one of the points from a vendor's perspective is, and we'll come on to this in a second, but the ability for policy to be a sort of standalone solution, I think, is increasingly more difficult to attain. The linkage back into a charging system is going to be the critical bit. And you're seeing some quite neat interfaces for people in terms of being able to actually configure it as a single entity, opposed to having to go into the rating system, set it up, go into the charging, the policy system, set it up separately as well. But if you can link those two things together, it makes life a little bit more simple for the operators. There it is. These are the components. The PCRF is the critical bit in terms of where the policies sit. The two interfaces, the GX interface goes down to the enforcement area. Quite often those are two separate vendors who supply those. They can be the same. The critical bit, and I think the changing bit, is the linkage between the online charging systems dictated by this SY interface. It's a 3GPP standard, which is being developed at the moment. Most vendors are conforming to that or working towards confirmation towards that. But that should enable you to put these things in a component manner. But the reality is, as I was saying, from an administration perspective, it's an increasingly important requirement those two things are done as a single entity. So just a little bit of a survey we were doing. You'll see the dark blue bit there is essentially investments in policy management. Well, guess what? One's moving forward. Most of them, over 50%, are going to be associated with real-time charging, RTC. Some examples, and in fact, funny enough, some of these came up a few years back, but we're looking at tiered pricing. There's a fairly well known in North America how those have worked out, some of the results there, and Verizon, obviously. It's had a real impact in terms of data revenue that's taken place in the States, real impact. So just a sort of pointer in the market space, one of the ones I found floating around the web. I'm going to look at just the final thoughts is where do we go from here? So kind of where we're at today, if we take the left-hand side, tier pricing plans, there's quite a few out there. Those are sort of some of the vendors who've done stuff in that space. Shared pricing plans, that's the sort of family plans. There's a few out there, and a growing number. And quality-based pricing plans, that's the ones both for sort of boosters and also for putting differentiated premium services in there. There's very few. So the journey has just started, really, in terms of the sophistication of this smart billings or policy-based billing activity. And I think that journey is going to continue. The level of sophistication is clearly going to continue in terms of the effort. The systems are being procured at the minute, shall we say, which enables this to take place. So, these are all the steps, and there's probably different strategies and ways that people are going to go in this. But effectively, the starting point really has happened over the last couple of years. And I think this is going to be the norm opposed to the odd exception, shall we say. So that was really it from my side. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
We're going to have an opportunity to pepper you with some questions in just a moment.
I can't wait.
First, we'll say thank you very much to Justin van der Lande.
Thank you.